question of censorship in science has come up a few times in the channel chat. Our atheist friends, whom I really appreciate, always deny there is any such thing. Ben Stein's documentary Expelled tells a very different story. Some of the most revealing accounts of censorship and persecution in science that I've come across are described in Brian G. Wallace's The Farce of Physics. But one famous case involves a man we met in episode 78, a man I had the privilege of studying under. Simon Holland featured this man in one of his YouTube videos.
As a kid growing up in the UK, the Royal Institution Christmas lectures fascinated me. In the 1970s, a friendly, straight-talking Yorkshire engineer called Eric Laithwaite was invited to host 4 Christmas lectures.
Watch it again carefully. A fact about a spinning wheel that so far everyone has missed.
There was a stunned silence. I remember it well. He unleashed the floodgates of the scientific establishment's wrath. You've brought science into disrepute. Laithwaite is no longer part of the club.
Well, what happened to bring all this about? Eric Laithwaite became famous for his brilliant electromagnetic innovations and for his talent for explaining complex things simply. So simply that even children could understand. He became a favourite television personality, and it was not only children who loved his presentations. He demonstrated things like his electric cannon, the fully developed linear induction motor, whose early prototypes he used to enthrall us as students at Manchester University. His motors became useful in many fields, such as vehicle safety testing and those stunning maglev trains. He was so well known and well respected that he was invited to give several lectures to the Royal Society, probably the most prestigious scientific establishment in the world. He was also invited to present the annual Christmas Lectures for Children. The 1973 lectures were the ones Professor Simon mentioned in his video. In the first 3 lectures, which were centred on Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass, he did mainly demonstrations with mirrors. He showed how mirrors could be arranged to give no left-right reversal. He showed how mirrors allowed him to do surprising tricks. He challenged them with all kinds of reflections, like a wheel, whose reflection spins in the same direction as the real wheel when seen from one orientation, but in the opposite direction when the wheel is turned through 90 degrees. He also explained how Alice saw the path in the garden as straight, but when she came to walk along it, it was crooked. He showed how Alice could not only have floated down the steps into the garden, but how she could float up the steps out of the garden. Everybody had a wonderful time, enjoyed every minute of it, and were challenged to think about things they'd taken for granted. Then he gave an evening lecture to the Royal Society. He was stunned by the response. He reproduced some of the demonstrations from the Royal Society at the 4th Children's Lecture. He had a young boy demonstrate a heavy gyroscope becoming light enough to lift as high as his head. He also showed a look-no-hands gyroscope apparently losing weight as well.
Let those who say I cannot make a body appear lighter than it is come and pull holes in that one.
Perhaps even worse, he warned the children about scientific intolerance.
What a pleasure it is to talk to young people who are ready to listen after you've talked to adults. Quite the most amazing letter I had was from a man who wrote quite unemotionally that he'd performed some of the experiments that I'd done some 10 years ago. And he knew that they worked, but he added, "I've not told any of my colleagues or friends because even though I occupy quite a senior post in the scientific civil service, I still have a few years to go to retirement and I still cherish hopes of further promotion." That is a hell of a thing to say in the scientific world, isn't it? This man dare not tell his colleagues. We talk about blackbirds pecking out the white feathers of their colleagues or killing them if they can't because they didn't conform. This man is afraid of being put away because he wouldn't conform. If the abominable no men outside this theatre, this is one of the letters I received, a man called my critics abominable no men. They say no before they've even watched.
And even worse than that, he suggested there were shortcomings in some untouchable areas of science.
So, however distasteful it is, we now have to say that object has got something more than a mass. It's got a mass, so long as, and a mass only, so long as we want to push it about in straight lines, weigh it, accelerate it, so on. But if we ever choose to spin it, it has another property, all of its own, which corresponds to the inductance of a coil. This is the updating of Newton's laws of motion. But I'm not saying that Newton's laws of motion are wrong. I'm merely pointing out they are restricted to motion in straight lines and to motion where there is no rate of change of acceleration, just as there was no rate of change of current for Ohm's law.
Then all hell let loose, as we can see in this television documentary made not long after the uproar.
Shocking! Ridiculous!
Last winter, Eric Laithwaite built a model of a new invention out of his boyhood Meccano set. When he first proposed it, he was at the height of his career and perhaps the most celebrated engineer in Britain. But the scientific establishment ostracised him because they thought the idea defied the laws of physics.
It's a new form of propulsion that the establishment said couldn't possibly work. This is a model of something which we have now established as a possible drive even for space vehicles, but nevertheless, as far as the establishment is concerned, this is heresy.
Laithwaite seems always to have had an enthusiasm for the strange and magical.
That's going nicely. The linear electric motor is a very simple idea. It's just an ordinary electric motor which has been unrolled and will produce a force.
He's best known as the developer of the linear motor.
We put the aluminium plate on the surface and switch on, and the effect of the force is now quite obvious.
In the 60s, as a young professor at Imperial College, Laithwaite developed scores of applications for the linear motor. In the 70s, one was used to power a British experimental high-speed train. But one day, he suddenly got bad news.
The tracked hovercraft company is at present in jeopardy, and it stands a chance of stopping just for lack of funds.
And stop it did when the British government pulled out. But Laithwaite wasn't beaten.
Switch on.
He immediately proposed an even better idea for a high-speed train.
Now you see the supported height is now about 6 inches, and 6 inches is more than the height you would need to suspend a high-speed train.
He'd made a linear motor levitate by electromagnetism.
We've designed a motor to propel it, which gives you the lift and guidance for nothing, literally for nothing, for no additional equipment and for no additional power input. This is beyond my wildest dreams that I should ever see that sort of thing occur.
Electromagnetism is, for me, the nearest thing we have to sheer magic. Two different directions of motion with one and the same set of coils.
But ironically for the public, Laithwaite was rapidly becoming an engineering superstar. An amateur inventor, Alex Jones, had brought Laithwaite a crude device which he said broke the laws of physics. Other scientists of Laithwaite's eminence might well have dismissed him as a crank, but Laithwaite was curious. Jones's device consisted of a weight hinged to an upright stand mounted on wheels. Just swinging the weight from side to side, said Jones, would propel the device a few feet forward, with no drive to the wheels, no external thrust. Laithwaite knew that was impossible, but Jones told him it wasn't, if the weight was a spinning gyroscope.
I thought I'd seen something that was impossible. Like everyone else, I'm brought up on Newton's laws of motion. The third law is supposed to have said for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. Therefore, you cannot propel a body outside its own dimensions. This thing apparently did.
So Laithwaite immediately set about investigating more impossible things a gyroscope might do.
I started to do experiments of my own. One of them was to make rather large spinning tops with most of the mass in the rim of the wheel. And these very definitely did something that looked impossible. And by 1973, Sir George Porter asked me if I'd do a discourse at the Royal Institution.
The Royal Institution is one of Britain's most august centres of scientific learning. It has a long tradition of inviting some of the nation's leading scientists to give a discourse about their work. The great scientist Faraday himself had been a frequent lecturer, but such was Laithwaite's standing that he too had been asked more than once to follow in his footsteps and address the cream of Britain's scientific establishment.
I've given a number of discourses.
Laithwaite decided to discuss his new research on gyroscopes.
I was very excited about it because I knew I had something to show them that was startling. And I did it rather in the spirit of, come and look what I've discovered, come and share this with me.
My closest friend.
It was only afterwards I realised that nobody wanted to share it with me.
Well, tonight, one of the
His mistake was to appear to challenge the very foundations of science, even Newton himself.
A gyroscope is a curious device in which conventional physics seems to go out of the window. First of all, we spin up the wheel, and it's then what I call live, as opposed to when it's not spinning, dead. So what I'm going to do is to hang this large weight on, and then as it's rotating, hang on the weight, it precesses, it has angular momentum about the vertical. We catch the weight next time round, hop, and the angular momentum just simply disappears. It seems to evaporate. It makes you question the validity of Newton's third law. Action and reaction are equal and opposite. And this is another experiment that appears to defy conventional physics. And you see, this is not doing what the physics book says it should, because the mass centre is certainly not the centre of rotation. And that's not what is supposed to happen.
He only learnt afterwards how his audience were taking it all.
There were several things in the lecture that were pure heresy.
It won't go away. That is a ridiculous thing to see.
To say that an object can rotate in a circle and not produce the full amount of centrifugal force, the man's obviously a lunatic. And the second thing was lifting the big wheel. How do you manage to lift a 50-pound wheel with one hand?
There is no way I can pick that up with one hand, not above there. I'm not a strong man, I don't into weight training. But when it's spinning, it's another matter. Release it, and it begins to climb almost on its own. No strain on my arm at all.
There must be some trick, was what people said. Whereas in fact I knew that once you got this thing precessing, it appeared to float. It did appear to lose weight.
And it was this idea that a gyroscope might lose weight that Laithwaite developed in his last experiment, one which was far too heretical for his audience and proved his final undoing.
So if the big wheel lost weight, the question is, will these little wheels lose weight when they're turned round and made to precess upward, just like the big wheel? Let's try. Now, each time the wheel comes down the wall, you see the needle kick back. It appears to give a lot of weight, as with the big wheel.
Laithwaite genuinely thought he was opening up a brand new area of research, and that as Britain's most famous engineer, he would be taken seriously.
Which you could use this loss of weight. This is certainly the most exciting experiment.
I was simply trying to tell them that, look, here's something very unusual that's worth investigating.
Historically, it seems to be almost an integral part of the scientific process. There have always been eccentrics in the history of science. There have always been Eric Laithwaite, and they've always been derided and marginalised. But I think in the last 10, 20 years, the process seems to have accelerated. It's become worse and worse as science has become more institutionalised, more bureaucratic. It's become almost entirely publicly funded. The sort of sanctions which institutional science is able to bring to bear on the eccentric have multiplied. And today, if you don't toe the line, and you don't have to make a radically new discovery, you can be ostracised simply for thinking about it.
But despite everything, Laithwaite was convinced gyroscopes had some kind of unusual force.
I feel that the establishment will not accept anything unless we've differentiated it twice.
A retired government engineer, Scovell, together with Laithwaite, thought the new force would show up in the complex mathematics of the gyroscope.
I suppose you could say, does it matter if science ridicules and ostracises a person who doesn't play by the rules? But I think it does matter. I think it matters to all of us because practically every major advance in technology in the last 100 years has been some kind of defiance of the rules. But this derision, this perception of the research being without value, without merit, that alone can be enough to kill off promising lines of research. The worrying thing about this is that when you look back at the history of science, it isn't those on the inside that produce the innovations, it's those on the outside. It's the Eric Laithwaite of this world, the people who are perceived as the eccentrics that produce the inventions.
The most depressing time was when I discovered there were no forces to be had from gyroscopes. They don't deal in force. The people who'd taken out patents, like Sandy Kidd and so on, were misguided. The mathematics said there were no forces, and that was correct. The thing that wouldn't go away was, I asked myself, can you lift a 50-pound wheel with one hand, or can't you? And is it a smooth motion, or you're not jerking it? No, it's smooth. And does the spinning top on the board not gyrate about its mass centre? That's right, it doesn't. Of all the critics that I showed lifting the big wheel, none of them ever tried to explain it to me. So I decided I had to follow Faraday's example and do the experiments.
He wanted to know if his sense that the wheel had lost weight was real or imaginary.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, very good. That's where the initial lift, and then that's where it feels like when it's going around the back of the neck. There's no doubt about the actual loss. No doubt about the weight loss there. Not at all.
Laithwaite and Dawson have spent the last 3 years deep in research.
The first thing we were trying to find out was how we could lift a 50-pound wheel with one hand. So we set out to try to reproduce this as a hands-off experiment. And we'd almost reproduced the effects we had with the big wheel, and we could get lift.
Oh, yes. Okay, try another side.
Then we tackled the problem of lack of centrifugal force. And indeed, the experiments were telling us that there was less centrifugal force than there should be. Meanwhile, of course, I was trying to do the theory, of course. I was still trying to do the mathematics. We devised more and more sophisticated experiments until, not long ago, we cracked it.
Okay, camera running. Ready?
Hang on. Ready?
2 gyroscopes precessing in tandem around a pivot.
Just to start.
For Laithwaite, this was the Eureka experiment.
0,
2, 3, 4, 5.
The real breakthrough came when we realized that a precessing gyroscope could move mass through space. The spinning top showed us that all the time, but we couldn't see it.
0.
If the gyroscope does not produce the full amount of centrifugal force on its pivot in the center,
2.
then indeed you have produced mass transfer.
3 squares.
38 to the halfway point.
Just 3 squares.
I continue.
Yep.
39.
It was more exciting than ever now because I could now explain the unexplainable. Gyroscopes behave absolutely in accordance with Newton's laws. We were now not challenging any sacred laws at all. We were sticking strictly to the rules that everyone would approve of, but getting the same result, a force through space without a rocket.
Lathwaite was not challenging Newton. He was challenging the very foundations of modern physics. Aspden had shown transfer of electrical and magnetic energy to and from the ether. He'd also done experiments which suggested that inertia could be transferred by the ether. And now Lathwaite was proposing mass transfer. And although he didn't mention the ether, he did say mass transfer through space. And everybody knew exactly what he meant. Let's continue Simon Holland's video from where we left off.
In my opinion, Eric Lathwaite was brilliant and stupidly ignored by the great and good of Britain. But what Eric Lathwaite really did was to produce a generation of little Lathwaite scientists, whom, like me, are not afraid to tackle the unpromising and the controversial. I thank you, Eric, so much for that. Never stop asking questions, because the truth is out there.
Yes, Professor Simon, the truth is out there. But secular science doesn't want to know. It claims there's no such thing as truth, and that science only seeks useful theories. It looks as if they want to stay imprisoned in the ruling paradigm. Jesus said, "Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." Thank you for joining me for this episode. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and press the bell so that you'll be notified as I release new movies. If you'd like to support this project, you're welcome to do so through Patreon. Find a link on my channel banner and in the description below.